Hello and welcome. In this video, we are going to take a look at an introduction to JavaScript. We're kind of just going to talk a little bit about JavaScript. We're not going to do any coding in this video. So if you're interested in coding, you probably want to move on to another one of the videos in the series. This video is part of a larger series of videos that focuses on HTML, CSS, client, and server-side scripting for the purposes of web development. Now, as I've already mentioned, we're not really going to do too much coding in this video. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the role that JavaScript plays, its origins, and also some of the resources that you can use among many, many resources that you'll find on the internet with respect to JavaScript. So first of all, JavaScript is sort of a multi-purpose scripting language. Now, we sort of de-emphasize or even not really take advantage of the fact that it is technically multi-purpose. By and large, it's pretty much the predominant web scripting language at this point. We're going to see in just a little bit that there are technically others, but we are in this series of videos going to focus on the ability of JavaScript to be able to manipulate our HTML and also our CSS. Now, what we want to do in this series of videos is sort of focus on a little bit of an introduction to JavaScript. There are many, many, many things that you can do with it, including having it operate both on the client and on the server side. And so in this introduction, what we're going to do, and in other videos, we're going to focus mainly on the role that JavaScript plays on the client side, meaning what role it plays in your browser to allow for your pages to seem more dynamic. In other words, basically, let's say, for instance, that you have a combo box that you wish to select an item from a combo box and then populate other text boxes. What code are you going to use to actually make those changes? Another example of something that you might want to do is basic validation. For instance, let's say that you have a input form for a user. Let's say you're collecting some basic information, their first name, their last name, their email address, and you just want to make sure that they've actually put in something meaningful. Well, JavaScript would be your client-side tool to do so. It does, however, not mean that it's the only way that you can go about doing it. But again, the role of JavaScript, as we're going to focus on for these first videos, will be on the client side. In other words, it's basically code that can run in your browser when you want your user to interact with your web page. Now, as you can see here on the screen share that I have, I'm using probably arguably the most debatable resource with respect to web development, that is the W3 Schools. Let me first emphasize the reason why they get a little bit of criticism, and that's just simply because most of their examples are pretty straightforward, and they don't necessarily focus too much on the big picture. Instead, what they do is they focus on getting somebody on board pretty quickly. And personally, I don't think that's a bad thing, because with all of the resources that we have on the internet with respect to JavaScript, finding documentation for JavaScript isn't all that hard. As a matter of fact, you'll see that we have both the W3 Schools page as well as the MDN documentation. The MDN Web Docs also has documentation on other resources as well, including HTML and CSS. This is perhaps a little bit drier, a little more concrete, and they also go into a little more details as far as the origin. For instance, they talk about the ECMA script language specification, which we'll talk about in just a second. But again, you want to sort of use a mix of resources when you are doing JavaScript development. The other thing to note here with JavaScript is it is not a dead language. In other words, it's not done evolving. If anything, it's evolving quite quickly. And even on the client side, the functionality is improving pretty significantly. JavaScript, by the way, in case you're interested, was first released in 1995. And it's taken a while to evolve and develop, but its current use is pretty much ubiquitous in all web browsers, which brings us to one other thing that we want to talk about before we start digging pretty deep into JavaScript, and that is the concept of this ECMA script. Now, it's interesting, JavaScript is actually only one web-based or web development scripting language that adheres to this ECMA script. It's sort of a standard for scripting languages, and by and large, though it is the predominant one to be used with development. And as you can see over here in the center of our page, you can see that there's other ones. You may even actually recognize a couple of them, particularly ActionScript and then Google's Apps script, in case you've played around with either of those. And before we start digging a little bit deeper into either of the documentation, we will want to point out one other thing about JavaScript, and that is the fact that you have a plethora of engines that will run JavaScript. The most common one that we're already familiar with, if you've used Microsoft Edge, Google Chrome, is going to be the V8 JavaScript engine that is provided by Google. Now, there are, again, some other ones, particularly SpiderMonkey and then JavaScript Core, that are used in other browsers. But the idea behind these JavaScript engines is they use a concept of just-in-time compile. The more recent ones, I should say, use this concept of just-in-time compiling to allow for the user to have a faster, more memory efficient browsing experience. Now, I'm going to provide all of these links for you in the description of this video. So let's go back real quick to talk about some of the resources, and specifically, let's take a look at the W3 schools. Now, again, in this particular video, I'm not going to go into many examples of JavaScript. I just want to sort of give you a high-level view of how you want to go about tackling learning a JavaScript. And you'll notice that, as with other pages on the W3 Schools site, you can simply try it yourself. In other words, you can take a look at some of the code behind some of these buttons. But what we want to do is we want to take just a quick look at what the role of JavaScript is. And as you can see, and as I've mentioned already, that it is supposed to sort of unify your use of HTML and CSS in a more dynamic fashion. It's probably one of the three pillars of languages that you want to learn with respect to web development. I would personally argue that there's a fourth, but for the purposes of this video, we're just going to focus on the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And the trick, or the key to note here with JavaScript, is it allows for you to edit HTML content by simply getting things by their ID, for example. In other words, you can reach into an HTML page, you can get an element by its ID, and then you can modify the properties of that element. You can do something as simple as just simply modifying the text of that element, or you can actually go in and modify the color, the font, and all sorts of other properties about that element. You can do that by modifying not only the HTML element itself, the attribute values, and then also the CSS, in other words, the style. And you can see here in this particular example that they have, you can see where you can actually change the font size of this particular demo element. You can change the color. You can change pretty much any of the properties associated with either the HTML or the CSS. Now, again, we're going to talk in later videos about the details of JavaScript, but we do want to point out one thing, that you have multiple locations where you can put the JavaScript. And so the easiest way of going about doing it is to simply put it inside of a pair of HTML script tags that will simply allow for you to run a particular block of JavaScript code. Now, we're not going to do too much of that because, again, that's probably not going to be your main way of going about using JavaScript, although there are plenty of reasons to go about doing it. And instead, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on actually creating JavaScript functions and events. And specifically, we're going to focus on the JavaScript functions. And just like most other programming languages, you have the ability to write functions and then reuse them in multiple places. And that is, again, going to be probably the most logical way for us to do that. Now, you have a couple of different places where you can actually put the JavaScript code. And again, we're going to talk about this in a later video, but those fundamentally break down to the same options that you have with style. You can put the JavaScript code in line with certain elements. You can break it up inside the document, much like you could do with your style sheets, or rather your CSS, your inline style. However, though, that became cumbersome to manage. And just like JavaScript, you probably wouldn't want to have your CSS all over the place in your HTML document, well, you probably also don't want to have your JavaScript, which brings to the next possibility of simply putting it in the head or the body. In other words, putting it early on in the document so that you have all of your functions essentially predefined in the body of the HTML. Now, again, we're going to take a look at those options in later videos, and we'll play around with some of them. But just be aware that, again, much like CSS, in other words, much like the style, that you could push it up to the top of your HTML document. You can do the same thing with your JavaScript. And then if you recall back to your style sheets, you had a third possibility, and that is that you could simply put it in another file. Now, the good news is there's virtually no difference in the syntax when you're using JavaScript in these three forms. As a matter of fact, I would argue there's virtually none, other than perhaps some use of semicolons and so on that we'll talk about in later videos and how you would go about calling the functions. But fundamentally, the idea is that you would push all of your functionality into an external .js file. And by the way, .js, you probably guessed, is the file extension for a JavaScript file, and you simply reference it in your HTML documentation, and then you can call any of the functions that you would have otherwise had in the head or the body of the document, except the difference being is that it is in a separate, more manageable .js file. Method by which you call it is exactly the same. And again, we'll get plenty of opportunity to take a look at that in later videos. Now, before I close out this video, I just want to point out some of the resources that you have. Most of it's going to be ubiquitous to any programming language. In other words, you can figure out, for instance, how you would do JavaScript comments. You would look at basic data types, variables, arithmetic, how you would assign values to variables, the equality operators, and so on. So again, you've got lots of resources here, and we'll be covering this in some of our future videos. And you can see here, for instance, these are some of the JavaScript data types. So again, if I'm seeming a little dismissive in this video, that's not the intention. It's sort of supposed to be motivational. In other words, that you see some of the resources that you have as it relates to JavaScript. And you can also see some of the resources that we'll use in some of our later videos. Again, we're going to kind of split some of our documentation between the W3 schools and the MDN just for a little bit of variety. And I guess I technically didn't click on this link, so we might as well go ahead and do that. And that is our JavaScript reference on the MDN web docs. And you can see it's pretty much just broken down a little differently. And again, you can see if we scroll down here, you can get some information. For instance, let's go down here just a little bit further, see if we can find something interesting. Yes, here we go. Why don't we take a look at how an if-else statement works? You can see, again, it's just a little bit different style of documentation. Other than that, you've got plenty of resources in which you can reference or leverage. I will try to stay mostly with the W3 schools and with the MDN. However, you will notice that there will be some external documentation, particularly when you start getting into newer, more advanced features in the Java client-side framework. Now, I do want to point out that we're not talking about any of our server-side Java in this video, and won't be talking about it in this series of videos. Those would involve separate libraries, and those may have their own separate documentation. Node.js, for instance, is a great example of that we won't be talking about in this series of videos. Now, as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.